We're midway the chapter, verse number 17. First Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17. But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all churches. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. That's something I've added and interjected there, but that's right. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called, being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also, he that is called, being free, is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price, be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God. The 7th chapter is about marriage, divorce, being single, widowhood. Is it good? Is it bad? What's best? All about those subjects. But right here in the middle of the chapter's a unit. It all goes together. But right here in the middle, Paul answering all of these questions that he has, he interjects verse 17 through 24, and it almost doesn't seem to fit. It's like Paul, first thought, I thought, Paul's running a rabbit here. What in the world is he doing? He needs to come back to the subject of marriage. And he does in verse number 25 through 40, the rest of the chapter. But we have this little section here. It almost seemed as if it were a parenthesis to me. And then he returns to the subject that he's been dealing with for the first 16 verses of the chapter. Well, when you look at the language, we realize the point that Paul is making. The Corinthian church is full of all kinds of people. And it's a seaport city. We've already seen it. There are single people, there are married people, there are believers who are married to unbelievers. There's divorce, there is remarriage, there are Jews and Gentiles, there are money people and poor people. There are some who are employers and some are employees. Some are servants, some are masters. You have all of these kind of people prominent in Corinth. And the point that Paul emphasizes in the verses 17 through 24, which we've just read, is that it's common for people to want to change their status. And not only that, there's this constant voice from the devil or anybody that the devil would use. Now you need to get discontent. Whatever you do, get discontent. And there's this push to change your current circumstances. If you're single, Well, you need to get married. If you're married, you need to get divorced and hunt for a better match and a better mate. If you're uncircumcised, you need to get circumcised. If you're a servant, you need to become a free man. Everybody needs to get discontent and change your circumstance. That's the voice that the world keeps throwing at everybody. And Paul tells the Corinthian church, remain in the life status that you are in. You say, how do you know that's what he's saying? Because he says in verse 8, abide. He says, let every man abide in the same calling. Verse 11, he says there in verse 11, he says, but if she depart, let her remain. Abide, remain. Verse number 20, listen to this verse. Let every man abide in the same calling where he's called. Did I just read that? Verse 8. I say unto you, therefore, unto the unmarried and widow, it's good for them if they abide. Just remain, even as I, he says. Verse number 24. Brethren, let every man wherein is called therein abide with God. Verse number 40, he uses, but she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. And I think I have the Spirit of God, he says. Look at verse number 27. Art thou bound unto a wife, seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife, seek not a wife. And then in verse number 17, he starts that section by acknowledging that God has providentially permitted you to be in your present circumstance, be content, and serve God. That's what this little section is really all about. And you know what? Often whenever we hear 1 Corinthians 7, we hear, those are all omitted. Oh no, they're the context. They're central to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 on marriage, divorce, single life, married believers being married to unbelievers. Widows, all of these things. Somebody ought to shout. That's a good little nugget, isn't it? And the fly is back, and I have got the perfect device to send it to bug heaven. Linda Paul sent it over here. She had it a while ago. So let's see two things. The responsibility of remaining in your state and the reasons for remaining in your state. Okay? The responsibilities. Verse number 17 through 19, we've just read about it. Circumcision and uncircumcision. Those are terms that are used to describe Jews and Gentiles. This church has a mix of Jews and Gentiles. When God calls you to salvation and you're put in the family of God, Jewish converts, they were not to try to change their Jewishness and become Gentiles. Gentiles were not to try to change their Gentileness and become Jews. In the book of Galatians, that's what we're told, verse 18 and 19. If anybody's called being a circumcised, let him not become uncircumcised. Any called in uncircumcision, let him not be circumcised. Circumcision's nothing. Uncircumcision's nothing. It's nothing. Now the book of Galatians informs us that there were Judaizers, Jews who were pushing, trying to teach that circumcision was a vital part of Christianity. And Paul here in this chapter says it's not important. Circumcision was a covenant sign given to the Hebrews in the Old Testament and the Old Covenant. So circumcision has no spiritual significance for Christians at all. Verse 20, Paul's repeating the principle he repeated in verse number 17. Remain. In light of that, remain in your present status. Gentiles don't have to then get physically circumcised so they will be real Christians. It's not so. Not so. Another status to remain in, verse 21 and 22, is a servant who is under a master. That servant is to realize that actually now that he's saved, he's a free man. He's the Lord's free man. And if you are free, you're not a servant. There were lots of servants, right? The percentages were high in Corinth. But having said that, there were some who were not. They were free men, not enslaved, not in bondage, financial bondage, so they have to be under some kind of mastering. And none of that kind of stuff. It said, you're still Christ's servant. So make sure you acknowledge that. Whatever status, social status, economic status you find yourself in. If you're an employee or employer, be content. Realize that you are God's servant wherever you are. Bottom line is verse 23 and 24. Look what he says. You are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. Don't think of your occupation as a servant of men. Brother, let every man wherein is called therein abide. You're bought with a price. Thereby, we're to do our task, whatever it is, acknowledging that I'm doing this because God's placed me here. In whatever task, whatever role you've got, whatever responsibility that you've been given, wherever you're at, God has providentially permitted you to be right there, right now. And in light of that fact, so whatever I'm doing, I'm not grumbling and fussing and complaining because God's put me here. I am striving to please Him because in it all, I am serving Him. So, the responsibility of remaining. Stay, don't change. Glorify God. Know that you're bought. Know that He's sovereignly involved in wherever you are presently. Now, he returns in verse number 25 to the marriage subject and primarily focuses on being single. And so we see point number 2, the reasons for remaining in your state. 6 reasons were given here in this last half. And particularly Paul, he emphasizes that it's better to remain single. All right to get married. He gives permission. He says it's all right to get married, but it's better to remain single. And he emphasizes why and tells why. So let's look at the 6 reasons for remaining in your present state. Okay? Verse 25. Paul says, now concerning virgins, those are single life people, right? I have no commandment of the Lord. I don't have any direct command that I can reference about this, he says, from God, about staying single. But he gives his own opinion and judgment about it as an apostle of God. He said, yet I give my judgment as one that has obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. And he said, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it's good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. Whatever your present situation is. And so what's his first kick point is, why? What are the reasons for remaining in your state? Because of the persecution from the world. He talks about the present distressing situation. That's a good reason to remain single, he says. What's he talking about? Well, Christianity is being persecuted. There are people who are being tortured. There are people who are being imprisoned. There are people who are losing their jobs over it. There are people who are losing their families over it. There are people who are going to be killed for the gospel. Just 10 years later, Nero, he fiercely persecuted Christians. Those days are coming. And he did severe things, like he would take a Christian, put that Christian in animal skins, and then throw them into a cage somewhere and let wild dogs loose on them. What would he do? Oh, he took their clothes and waxed it and then tied them to a tree in his garden and set them on fire so he'd have candles for his garden. So we understand why Paul is saying the present distress. You better think about whether you ought to get married and have some kids. It may not be wise in the present circumstance. He's saying you're going to wind up with trouble. There's what happens whenever dad goes to prison and mom and kids don't have any finances or food. What happens whenever they see him dragged or her dragged out, or the child dragged out into public life and beaten or killed? It might not be best in present situation, distressing situation, to get married. Second reason to remain single that he gives is the problem of the flesh. In verse number 28, but if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. That's a good word. In light of the fact this morning we saw that there are some in Corinth who are saying that you sin, that you ought to be totally abstinent. Even if you're married, it'd be good for you to go ahead and separate from your husband or wife, because you're going to be more holy and more spiritual if you don't have any sexual life. And it was a ditch that they'd fallen into because they were previously pre-conversion, had been all wrapped up in sexual thinking and perversion. With the temple of Aphrodite up there and 1,000 prostitutes bleeding their way down to the seaport to everybody. And Paul says, but if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble, thlipsis. Thou shalt have pressure, crushing pressure. It means to compress, to squeeze, to bring pressure. You're going to have trouble if you get married. Well, that's an encouraging word, isn't it? Husband-wife relationship, family and with children, marriage. It's the soil God uses to grow us. It is. tribulation bringeth patience. What's happening? God grows us through it. There's stuff you can handle tonight that you couldn't have handled 10 years ago. Child of God. God's grown you through a lot of difficulties. And some of that difficulty that just comes naturally comes through marriage and children, having family. It's true. What's God do? He uses all of it to break us of selfishness. Oh, you didn't know how selfish you were until you got married. Right? You didn't what's even worse, you didn't know how selfish that mate was until you got married. You were thinking, oh man, we're in dreamland and this is just wonderful. And yeah, it doesn't take long. You'll find out that there's issue with it all. So, the problems of the flesh. Third thing, the passing of this life. Look at verse number 29 and following. But this I say, brethren, note the time factor. The time is short. Why should somebody remain single? Or why should somebody remain in the same state that they're in, married? What if somebody's a widow? Why should I stay in my present marital state and all? Because time's short. It is. Ask us, young folks, ask us. I don't care who you talk to, anybody you talk to, the older they get, they go, man, time just flies. And it does. You go, 64 years of age, how did I get here? I remember when I was 4, not 64. Am I 64? Right? Yeah, Miss Barb. Oh, well, I won't say. But I will say this. She got a 4 in there. Look on. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not, and they that use this world as not abusing it for the fashion. And now look at this last phrase. This world passeth away. Time is short. This world passes away. And the word here is you should think about marriage and mourning and merriment and merchandise, and don't get carried away with any of it, because all of it is temporary. View with the perspective that all is temporary. Even marriage. You say, well, I know my mate whenever I get to heaven. Well, yeah, you'll know your mate, but having said that, it's going to be a different relationship than what it is presently. So, the passing of this life. All right, number 4, reasons to remain in your present state. The preoccupations of marriage. Now he pours into it more. He says, but verse 32, but I would have you without carefulness, full of care, worry, troubling. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. It just makes sense that if you're not married, you can focus on ministry more. Right? But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. And that's number 1 right there, you know. Man, I'm going to have to keep her happy. I have to figure this out. And not just out of obligation, of course. Right, men? Men ought to be saying amen real big right there. I'm trying to cover my tracks here. There is a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that's married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. So it works the other way around too, guys. And this speak for your own profit. This I speak for your own profit. Not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. Right? Marriage involves caring for spouse and house and children and dog and yard mowing and homework and all of those kinds of things. But a single man or woman has freedom to serve the Lord without distraction, as much distraction. The example that I always think about is Dr. Percy Ray. He was going to marry R.G. Lee, the prominent R.G. Lee's daughter, pastor of Memphis for all of those decades, Bellevue Baptist. And the Lord clearly spoke to that young man and told him, you're not going to get married. He wrestled with God about it. You can read about it in his book, in the book. He struggled about it. He loved her. And he wanted to get married. And the Lord said no. And he resigned to it. And when he did, God told him, he said, I've got something that's going to require all your time and all you're going to have to, you can't have a family, you can't. And God used him to plant, I think, 37 churches. Pretty good. And then they had Camp Moore, but they have forever camp twice a year. And in the early days, of course, days of Brother Ray, thousands came twice a year from all over the world. And God birthed churches out of that and called preachers, here's one, out of that camp. God sent missionaries all over the world out of that camp. He didn't like sleeping. He went to the doctor and asked if the doctor could pinch those nerves that go, particularly that would, so he didn't ever have to sleep. And the doctor said, you can't do that. It'll kill you. You can't. You have to have it. That's just the way you're made. You can't go like that. But you know what? It doesn't make any difference. He's preaching. He working. Preached all over the country in the 1900s. Always having Rob Pelkey or somebody drive him, because if he was sleeping, he was in the back seat sleeping. Just on the way at night to the next meeting. You can't have a wife and do that. You can't. It's not possible. The Apostle Paul, he can't be on his missionary journeys all over everywhere and still have a wife and kids back at the house. So, there is a distraction. And let me say this though. Remain in your present status. If God's given you a wife and given you kids, well, my big responsibility, ladies, your big responsibility is to tend to the kids. Yeah. Daddies, your big responsibility is to provide for the home. Yeah. And mow the yard. Right? I mean, I'm being silly, but you get the point. There's a lot wherever you're at. But God does call people to be single. But if you're called, let me hasten to say this, you better have the gift. We discussed that this morning. Otherwise, you'll burn in your passions and they'll be out of control. The preoccupation of marriage. All right, fifthly, the promises of the fathers. The promises of the fathers. Verse 36 through 38. Look at this. But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, and this is talking about a father toward daughters. Where it says virgin there, you can put daughter. Okay? If any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, she's getting older, she's, you know what they say, oh, she's 25 years old, she's an old maid. You hear me? If she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not. If she requires that she get married, then the father is to let him do what he will. And said, let them marry. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart. You say, what's this talking about? What we have is, in Roman culture, Jewish culture, you have arranged marriages. Right? Good, bad, whatever. Parents, particularly fathers, were responsible. Especially if they have dedicated their daughter to the Lord's service. It's happened, right? Samson's mom and daddy, Samuel's mom Hannah, said, this child is for God. But what if that child gets to the place that they say, I want to get married? That's the issue that's being dealt with. He says then, let her marry. She can get married. Verse 37. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, the father, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin. Ooh, that's not what I expected. The Father doeth well. So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. Throw that standard on our culture. Can you imagine it? Well, I've got a daughter or a son, whichever. I've dedicated them to God, and no, they're not getting married. They're going to work for God. They're going to work at the church. They're going to work in the ministry. We've got it already arranged, and from a baby, we've got it fixed and figured. And this is the way it's going to operate. And now, lo and behold, they want to get married. Apostle Paul, first pastor, tell us what to do. And Paul said, it's all good if they get married. You're free from your commitment about it, fathers. But now let me say this. If you are determined in your heart that she can't get married, me personally, preferentially, in this environment that we have got in our culture in that day, it's better if she doesn't. And you got kids in Baptist churches today that say, "Oh, my parents are so hard." What about this one? Man, that's pretty tough. No, the Apostle Paul gave me word under the Holy Ghost that I could keep you at the house and you can serve God at the church. Well, I get you that. Oh. So, Paul gives reasons to remain in your present state, the promises of the fathers. It's pretty apparent that Paul valued single life, didn't he? He did. All right, number 6. Why remain in your present state? Because of the permanency of marriage. Verse 39 and 40. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she's at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Let me say this. For unmarried, for the young folks, that's why it's important to marry a Christian. Because marriage is to be for life. It is. We commit to all kinds of stuff, don't we? We commit to a cell phone contract, a car loan, house payment mortgage, rent maybe. And yet God says here, people are to be committed to marriage for life. And somebody that's not married, you better be certain about it. It's not just fly-by-night stuff. This is important stuff to God. Conclusively, single, married, married to unbelievers, divorced, remarried, widowed. That middle section that we started with is important. From this point on, remain in your God-permitted state and be content in the providential place where God has placed you. Single, married. I got saved like the Corinthians did, and now I've got an unsaved mate and they don't want to get saved. Remain believer with unbeliever. Right? All of these remains. And seek to serve God, to glorify God, to please God, to worship God, to tell of God's goodness and grace from henceforth and for the rest of this life. Let's stand. Abide. Remain. Paul tells husbands or wives who are married to unbelievers, or who has an unbeliever who's decided they're going to leave. Paul tells them, remain where God has providentially placed you. Far less than ideal circumstances. Well, we don't have the best marriage. God says, do the best you can to stick with it. Look to me for help. And child of God, in a believer-unbeliever situation, you're preventing, you have a sanctifying effect on them, on that home. You may be the only reason that God hadn't lowered the boom on an unsaved mate. You actually brought the blessing of God to the home. Even the favor of God to that home. Anyone have a word before we dismiss?